Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about Burton Raffel's wonderful translation of the Old English epic poem, Beowulf. Beowulf is one of my favorite books, and I love epic poetry as a genre. And it's a book that I've had the chance to read, like many people, in high school and in college, and read a couple of different translations. Seamus Heaney's translation is one that I've liked in the past. But my wife is actually part of a book group with some other ladies in our church, and they decided to read through Beowulf and got this edition. It's very affordable. You can find it on Amazon for, I think it's like $4 or something. So we bought another copy, another translation of Beowulf, and I never read this one by Burton Raffel, and so I thought I would go ahead and read along and have the chance to reread this wonderful epic poem. So a bit about the poem for those who either have not had the chance to read it or maybe needed a bit of refresher since you looked at it years ago. Beowulf is viewed as sort of one of the foundation stones of English literature. I believe it is the oldest work that we have in the English language. And if you look at it, it is written in Old English, which a lot of people kind of popularly will talk about, like, oh, the King James Bible, or Shakespeare as being Old English. That's not Old English. That's High Middle English. Old English is way back before that. If you were to look at it, you would recognize a few, prepositions and pronouns and things, but by and large, it's incomprehensible to a modern English speaker. And if you were to hear it spoken, it would sound a lot more like Dutch or German than what you and I think of as English, because the Old English that Beowulf is written in is written before the Norman conquest. So English today is this amalgamation of Anglo-Saxon Germanic vocabulary and syntax and language with the influence of French, obviously coming from Latin, and with a lot of Greek words as well. So you have this kind of combination of those two streams in modern English. But this book is being written before those two streams come together. So it's tapping into a very old tradition, not only in terms of the language, but in terms of the setting and the world. And so it's something that, on the one hand, it's at the headwaters of our culture for those of us who are English speakers, or those like myself. You could probably tell from my red hair and blue eyes, right? My ethnic roots are in the British Isles and northwestern Europe. So for those of us, in that context, it's kind of going back to those cultural roots, and yet it's kind of exotic and feels very foreign. Beowulf is interesting because although it is sort of the first work of English literature, it doesn't take place in England or the British Isles at all. It's really focusing on the area of Scandinavia, Denmark, Sweden, that kind of area, and the travels back and forth there that are taking place. We think our best guess is that the events that Beowulf is describing are kind of based in probably the 6th century. But the manuscript that we have, and we only have one copy of Beowulf, which was discovered, years after the fact. We only have one copy, and we are guessing that was written in the 9th century, maybe. So we're looking at a story that, in terms of the writing of it, is at least 1,000 years old, maybe more. And the story, and probably the writing that we have of it, is the record of an oral tradition or story that had been in existence for a couple hundred years before that. So we're tapping into something whose roots go back probably 14 or 1,500 years. So it's an ancient tale and wonderful. It's a wonderful gift that God preserved this one manuscript, because it gives us a great window into not only the development of the English language, but the culture at that time. And it focuses on the character of Beowulf. So the story is set in Denmark originally, where you have this great king Hrothgar, whose kingdom is being terrorized by this monster called Grendel. And every night, his warriors go to sleep in his great hall, and when they least expect it, the monster will break in and kill soldiers and carry them back off to his lair, and no one is strong enough to do anything about it. And so the whole crisis here is that this kingdom is under attack from an enemy that it can't go up against, it can't defeat. And so they're waiting for some salvation. enter Beowulf. So then we have Beowulf, who is one of the Geats, you can, like the Swedes, who comes over. He hears about this monster, and so he's this brave, strong hero, and so he comes to Hrothgar and says, I will defeat this monster for you. And so kind of the first act of the poem is, setting up the problem, Beowulf arising, and then him doing battle with and eventually killing this monster Grendel. And then we have King Hrothgar pouring out riches and blessings upon Beowulf, and there's great friendship forms and all of that. Well, then the second act of the story is we find out that Grendel was not alone. His mother also dwelled, in the marshes and underwater, and she, sees her son has been killed, and so she comes to take her revenge, and Beowulf has to then go and fight her, and so there's this big epic battle, between the two of them, and he ends up once again being victorious, and more speeches are given, more riches are shared, and Beowulf then goes back home. Then we fast forward 50 years, and we meet Beowulf again. This time he has become the king of his own people, and he has ruled for a long time, and he's had these great battles, and he's been this great hero, but he's now kind of the same age that Hrothgar was, and he's coming towards the end of his days, and this dragon is awoken in his land and is terrorizing people, and all of a sudden, he's the king of the kingdom who's being terrorized by this great beast, this great monster. And so he goes out to do battle against it again. And so the final act is Beowulf going against the dragon. And he ends up, with the help of one of his thanes, he ends up being able to defeat the dragon, but he's fatally wounded in the process. And so the story ends with Beowulf's death. And not only his death, but with him, the great king and warrior, dying, all of a sudden all the other countries and nations around the Geats are going to begin to attack them, and it's going to be pulled back into this cycle of chaos and war and all this type of thing. And the story ends there. So it's a fascinating story because it gives you a window into the way that these different kingdoms and cultures worked. It gives you a window into the things that they valued and the things that they thought about. You can see just from the kind of sketch of things, strength, valor, bravery, all of these are kind of virtues in this society. And the overarching theme, and it comes up again and again in the book, is everyone is going to die. Everyone is going to face death. The question is, how do you face it? And Beowulf is seen as this great hero, even though in the end of the story, he's defeated because he faces death well. He's not afraid. And he's contrasted at different points in the story with other men who don't rise to the occasion. In fact, in the final battle, kind of the big scene is, he goes with a number of his knights, his followers, who have all talked about the bravery they're going to have and how they'll help Beowulf. And Beowulf goes to fight the dragon himself. And then he's being overwhelmed by the dragon. And instead of going to his aid, all of his followers leave except one. And so you get this contrast again between those who show their bravery and when they're facing the hardship, and those who don't have what it takes when it matters most. So it's a wonderful, wonderful story. It's very bloody, as you can imagine. It's very violent. It's one that boys, I think, especially love when they can read it, because it's just a good adventure story. But there's a lot more going on. I won't get into all the different aspects of the story. I mean, I think the best thing is read it yourself, think about it, discuss it, find a group to go through it with. This translation does have a nice little introduction, which is it's gonna go through the plot kind of like I did. So for new readers, maybe you just read the poem and then go back and read the introduction after the fact. But it'll help you kind of situate, the poem historically and thematically. But one of the things that's often perplexing to people is there are a lot of kind of side speeches given in the poem that might feel like digressions from the main story or the main plot. And in some ways they are. You could remove those and you would have a smoother kind of walk through the plot. But each of those side speeches or stories are given for a reason. They're giving us insight into the speaker sometimes. They're giving us insight into the history and culture within which these stories are taking place. And they're often kind of little anticipations or echoes of things that are going to happen later in the story. And one of the things that's so cool about this poem, again, we have almost no literature from this time period. This is kind of the representative sample. And we imagine that whoever wrote this probably wrote other great poems that would be in our anthologies today if we had them. We don't. But one of the great things about this poem is that it references so many other stories. So even though we don't have the full things, we've got a sense that there's this richer, broader world that this poem is existing within. And it's interesting to me to read this as someone who loves the writings of Tolkien, like so many of us do, because Tolkien absolutely loved Beowulf. He saw it as kind of his lodestar, and he did some significant academic work in terms of translating Beowulf, but also arguing for how we should think about and interpret Beowulf. But you cannot read Beowulf without hearing Tolkien copying the themes and the voice and the culture. Not exactly. He does his own thing with it. He's very creative. But you can see the influence from this old English epic to what Tolkien is going to do with his Lord of the Rings and his other Middle-earth books. So it's fascinating to kind of see that connection and to see that play out. So it's one of those books that is significant for historical reasons. It's significant from a literary perspective in terms of the influences it will have, but it's also just a really good story with really strong characters. One of the things I love is that the author is able to give a tremendous amount of nuance and character development with just a few lines. So, not only characters like Beowulf or Hrothgar who get a lot of screen time and who get to talk a lot, but even more minor characters like Unweth or I'm going to mispronounce the names here. The character at the end, Wiglaf, I think is his name, or even unnamed characters, like in that third act when the dragon awakes. The way he awakes is there's a runaway slave who ends up accidentally finding his lair, and he takes a cup so he can pay back his master and not be punished. And the way the poet describes that man and what happens to him is actually amazingly complex. And you kind of get the sense of this poor guy he's just kind of fallen into something far bigger than himself, and he ends up being caught between man and monster, between man and beast, as it were. And so, just wonderful little descriptions and insights into human character, the relationship of things. And it's a book about kingship, about manhood, about bravery, about virtue. And it represents one of the things that's fascinating. I'll kind of end with this because there's so much you could say about Beowulf, but it represents the coming together of the pagan world and the Christian world. In fact, as literary scholars have kind of looked back at this poem from our vantage point, some people have said, well, this was probably just a pagan epic that then got carried into the Christian era, and so some monk had to go back and kind of add in some references to God, because you get references to the Bible, acknowledgments of God's character, all those kinds of Christian elements are very overt throughout the poem. So some people imagine, well, that's just sort of this veneer of Christianity put on this basically pagan thing. Others, though, and Burton Raffel kind of gives this argument in the introduction, I think he's right, is that what we get is a story that is obviously drawing on these this pagan culture and elements, but is being told as a Christian story itself. So I don't think that those are just sort of tacked on, in part because if you remove those Christian elements from the story, it doesn't work as well. It doesn't carry the same punch. It becomes just sort of a monster story that wouldn't seem to fulfill the poet's vision of what he's after and what he's doing. It wouldn't satisfy the complexity of what's going on here. So I think what you're getting is actually a wonderful exploration of what does it look like for the gospel to impact a culture and to give shape to and to reshape the stories that they told about themselves. So it's a fascinating book, so much to discuss, so much to think about. It's actually a fairly easy read, especially if you get a good translation like this. I haven't said a lot about the translation, but I do like it. I'm no scholar to sort of say about what's most accurate, but this is a well-respected translation. Came out in 1963, I think, so it's time-tested, but very readable. He works in some kind of modern literary devices. He's got lots of alliteration and things. So it feels poetic, but it's not hard to understand. It's not hard to read. It's much easier than Shakespeare, even though the work is a lot older. And I think it's something that, again, an interested middle, high schooler, definitely college and beyond, should be able to read and appreciate. And I think this is a good, it's cheap, it's handy, it's small. The text itself is about, I think, 120 pages, so you can read it fairly quickly, and it's a gripping tale. Once you pick it up, you won't want to put it down until you finish the whole thing. So if you haven't read it in a long time, or maybe you just read snippets in school, pick it up and reread, or read for the first time perhaps, Beowulf.